My name is Milton, and I'm 63 years old. 3 weeks ago, I lost my son David in a car accident, and today was supposed to be the day I'd learn what he left behind. I was standing in my driveway, keys in hand, ready to drive to the lawyer's office for the will reading. The morning felt heavy, like the grief I'd been carrying since that terrible phone call. But there was also this small flame of hope burning in my chest. Maybe through David's will, I'd understand more about the man my boy had become. Maybe I'd find some peace in knowing his final wishes. I had no idea that what I was about to discover would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you've ever had to deal with family drama, and subscribe, because this story is about to get much more complicated than I ever imagined. Let me back up and tell you about my life before that morning turned everything upside down. I've been a widower for 5 years now, ever since my beloved wife Margaret lost her battle with cancer. We'd built a good life together in our modest 2-story home in Riverside. I worked as a civil engineer for 37 years, building bridges and roads that would outlast me. Margaret was a school teacher who touched hundreds of young lives. When she passed, our son David became my anchor, my reason to keep going. David was 32, brilliant as his mother, and had made something remarkable of himself as a software engineer. He'd bought this beautiful house in Highland Park, one of those restored craftsman homes with original hardwood floors and a wraparound porch. I was so proud watching him succeed where I'd only dreamed. He had everything I'd worked my whole life to give him the foundation for. Then 3 years ago, he married Sarah. She was 30, worked in marketing for some tech startup downtown, and initially I genuinely liked her. Sarah was charming, laughed at my old engineering jokes, and seemed to make David happy. She had this way of lighting up a room when she walked in. Auburn hair catching the sunlight, always dressed perfectly for whatever occasion. During their engagement, she'd call me every Sunday asking about my week, inviting me over for dinner. But something shifted after their wedding. The Sunday calls stopped. The dinner invitations became less frequent, then disappeared entirely. When I'd call David, Sarah would answer and say he was busy with work projects, deadline pressures. You know how it is. At first, I believed her. The tech industry is demanding, and David had always been dedicated to his career. The last family dinner we had together was David's 32nd birthday, 6 months before the accident. I remember sitting at their dining room table watching Sarah hover behind David's chair, her hand constantly on his shoulder like she was guarding him. When I tried to share a funny story about David's childhood, she'd interrupt with comments about how busy they were, how they needed to wrap up early. David seemed tired, thinner than usual, and when I asked if he was feeling all right, Sarah quickly answered that he'd been working too hard. After that birthday dinner, my contact with David became sporadic phone calls where he sounded distant, distracted. I chalked it up to the normal evolution of a son's life, the natural way children pull away from parents when they start their own families. Margaret used to warn me about not being the interfering father-in-law, but deep down something felt wrong. The accident happened on a Tuesday night in late September. David was driving home from what Sarah called a late client meeting. His car veered off the winding road near Griffith Park and hit a tree. The police report said he'd fallen asleep at the wheel, possibly from exhaustion. No alcohol, no drugs. Just a young man who'd worked himself to death, literally. I was destroyed. In the 3 weeks since the funeral, I'd rattled around my empty house like a ghost. My neighbor Eleanor, a 75-year-old retired librarian who lived next door, was the only person who regularly checked on me. She'd bring casseroles I barely touched and sit with me on the front porch, sharing memories of watching David grow up in our neighborhood. The morning of the will reading, I woke before dawn, unable to sleep. I'd chosen my best black suit, the one I'd worn to Margaret's funeral, and then David's. My hands shook as I knotted my tie, thinking about how this would be the final chapter of my son's story. Whatever David had written in his will would be his last words to me, his final way of saying goodbye. I was standing beside my old Ford pickup truck, the same one I'd taught David to drive 15 years earlier, when I heard Eleanor's voice cutting through the morning quiet. "Milton, Milton, wait." I turned to see her rushing across her front yard, still in her bathrobe and slippers, her gray hair uncombed. Eleanor was usually meticulous about her appearance, the kind of woman who wouldn't step outside to get the newspaper without being properly dressed. Seeing her in such a state immediately put me on edge. She reached me, breathing hard, and grabbed my arm with surprising strength. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she kept glancing between my face and my truck. "Don't start the car, Milton," she whispered urgently. "Your daughter-in-law did something. I saw her at your car early this morning around 5 a.m. My blood went cold. "What do you mean, Eleanor? What did you see?" She pulled me away from the truck, her voice dropping even lower. "I was up early, you know how I am, couldn't sleep. I was watering my roses by the hedge that separates our driveways. I saw Sarah's little blue Honda pull up in front of your house, and she got out with some kind of toolkit. She spent maybe 15 minutes under your truck working on something near the wheels. When she finished, she looked around real nervous, then drove off quick." My hands started trembling. Sarah had never come to my house before without David, and certainly never at 5 in the morning. "Are you sure it was her?" "Positive. I know that car, and I know her face. Milton, she didn't see me because I was hidden behind the hedge, but I watched her the whole time. Whatever she was doing under there, it wasn't good." I walked around my truck slowly, Eleanor beside me, and crouched down to look underneath. At first I didn't see anything unusual, but then I noticed a small puddle of fluid directly under the brake area. Fresh fluid still wet on the asphalt. "Oh God," I breathed. Eleanor was already pulling her cell phone from her bathrobe pocket. "I'm calling Joe Martinez from the garage. He's been working on cars in this neighborhood for 20 years. He'll know what to look for." While we waited for Joe, my mind raced through the implications. If Sarah had sabotaged my brakes, she was trying to kill me. But why? What could she possibly gain from my death? I wasn't wealthy, my house was modest, my pension was small, unless... Joe arrived in his tow truck within 15 minutes, a heavy-set man in his 50s with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails. He'd serviced my Ford for the past decade and knew every quirk of the old vehicle. "Let me take a look, Mr. Burton," he said, sliding under the truck with a flashlight. After 5 minutes of examination, he emerged with a grim expression. "Someone cut your brake line," he said simply. "It's a small cut, real subtle. Would have held for maybe 10-15 minutes of driving, then failed completely when you hit the brakes hard. At highway speed, that would have been fatal." Eleanor gasped, but I felt strangely calm, like pieces of a puzzle were finally clicking into place. "Can you prove it was deliberately cut?" Joe nodded. "This wasn't wear and tear or an accident. Someone used a sharp knife or razor blade, made a precise incision designed to weaken the line gradually. It's an old trick, unfortunately. Makes it look like equipment failure instead of sabotage." I stood there in my driveway, staring at my truck, realizing how close I'd come to following David to the grave. If Eleanor hadn't been up early tending her roses, if she hadn't happened to see Sarah, I would have driven to that will reading and never arrived. "We need to call the police," Eleanor said. "Not yet," I replied, my mind working. If Sarah tried to kill me before the will reading, there must be something in David's will that she doesn't want me to hear. I need to get to that lawyer's office, but not in my truck. Joe offered to drive me in his tow truck, but I called a taxi instead. I wanted to arrive at the law office without anyone knowing about the brake sabotage. If Sarah thought I was dead in a car wreck somewhere on the freeway, she might reveal more than she intended. As the taxi pulled into my driveway, Eleanor squeezed my hand. "Be careful, Milton. If she's desperate enough to try murder once, she might try again." The taxi ride to downtown took 45 minutes through morning traffic, and every mile gave me more time to think. I stared out the window at the familiar streets of Los Angeles, but my mind was spinning through memories of David's recent behavior, looking for clues I'd missed. 2 months before the accident, David had called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. He typically called on weekends, and even then our conversations had become stilted and brief. But that Tuesday call was different. His voice sounded strained, like he was fighting off a cold, and he kept pausing mid-sentence. "Dad, I've been thinking about Mom a lot lately," he'd said, "about how she used to worry about people taking advantage of our family because we were too trusting." I'd thought it was an odd comment at the time. Margaret had always been cautious about new people, but I wouldn't have described our family as particularly trusting or vulnerable. "Are you feeling okay, son? You sound tired." "I've been having some health issues," David had admitted. "Headaches, nausea, trouble concentrating at work. Sarah thinks it might be stress." Now, sitting in that taxi, those words took on a sinister meaning. What if Sarah hadn't just thought it was stress? What if she'd been causing it? Then I remembered the most important call, the one that had haunted me for 3 weeks. 2 days before the accident, David had phoned me late at night. I could hear Sarah's voice in the background asking who he was talking to. David had waited until her voice faded, then spoken quickly and quietly. "Dad, If anything happens to me, remember I love you. And there are things you need to know about Sarah. Important things. I can't talk about it now, but I want you to know that everything I have, everything I've worked for, it should go to family. Real family. I'd been half asleep and frankly a little annoyed by what seemed like David being overly dramatic. Nothing's going to happen to you, son. You're young and healthy. Get some rest. Promise me you'll remember what I said. I promise, David. That was the last conversation I had with my son. 3 weeks of guilt had convinced me that I'd failed to take his concerns seriously, that maybe if I'd pressed him harder, asked more questions, I could have prevented his death. Now I realized that David might have been trying to warn me about more than I'd understood. The taxi pulled up in front of the Lawton and Associates building, a sleek glass tower in the financial district. I paid the driver, took a deep breath, and walked into the lobby. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt like ascending toward some final judgment. The law office reception area was elegant, but not ostentatious leather chairs, mahogany tables, diplomas, and awards covering the walls. The receptionist, a professional woman in her 40s, directed me to a conference room where the will reading would take place. Sarah was already there, and seeing her sent a chill down my spine. She was dressed in a black designer dress, her auburn hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, diamond earrings that I remembered David buying for their second anniversary. She looked every inch the grieving widow, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. When she saw me walk in, her expression shifted for just a moment. It was subtle, but I caught it, a flash of surprise, then disappointment, then something that looked almost like anger. She'd been expecting to hear that I died in a car accident on the way here. "Milton," she exclaimed, rising from her chair and embracing me. "I'm so glad you made it safely. I was worried when you didn't answer your phone this morning." I hadn't received any calls from Sarah. My phone had been with me the entire morning. She was already lying. "Traffic was heavy," I said, simply watching her face. "How's your truck running? David always worried about you driving that old thing." Another lie. David had never expressed concerns about my truck to me, and the Ford was only 8 years old, hardly a dangerous vehicle. "The truck's fine," I replied, not mentioning the taxi. Robert Lawton, the lawyer, entered the conference room precisely at 10 a.m. He was about 60, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man who'd spent decades handling delicate family matters. Behind him came 2 other people I recognized, Jake Thompson, David's business partner at the software company, and Linda Martinez, David's secretary. Jake was a tall, thin man in his early 30s who'd worked with David for 5 years. They'd been close friends as well as business partners, and Jake had delivered a moving eulogy at David's funeral. Linda was a motherly woman in her 50s who'd been David's executive assistant for the past 3 years. She'd always been warm and professional when I'd visited David's office. "Thank you all for coming," Lawton said, settling into his chair at the head of the polished conference table. "Before we begin, I want to express my condolences. David was a remarkable young man, and his loss is felt by everyone who knew him." Sarah dabbed at her eyes again, but I noticed she kept glancing at her phone, which was face down on the table beside her purse. She seemed anxious, fidgety, constantly checking the time on her watch. "Now then," Lawton continued, opening a thick folder. David's will was updated quite recently, just 2 weeks before his passing. This updated version supersedes all previous wills and testamentary documents. Sarah's head snapped up. "Updated? He didn't mention updating his will to me." Lawton nodded professionally. "It's not uncommon for people to handle such matters privately. David came to my office personally, spent several hours ensuring every detail was exactly as he wanted it." Lawton spread the will documents across the table, his reading glasses catching the light from the conference room's large windows. "Let's begin with the specific bequests," he said, clearing his throat. "To Jake Thompson, my business partner and friend, I leave my collection of vintage computer equipment and programming books, along with $10,000 in appreciation for 5 years of collaboration and friendship." Jake nodded gratefully, tears in his eyes. "To Linda Martinez, my executive assistant, I leave $5,000 and my office furniture in gratitude for her professionalism and kindness." Linda smiled through her own tears, pressing a tissue to her eyes. "To the Los Angeles Children's Hospital, I leave $25,000 to support their pediatric cancer research program." Sarah's foot was tapping under the table now. These charitable bequests were eating into what she clearly expected to inherit. "To various other charitable organizations." And Lawton read through a list of smaller donations totaling another $15,000. Then he paused, looking directly at Sarah and me. Now we come to the disposition of the major assets, the house investment accounts, life insurance proceeds, and David's business ownership stake. Sarah leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. To my wife, Sarah Burton, I leave my personal effects clothing, jewelry, and the sum of $50,000 from my savings account. Sarah's face went pale. $50,000 was a significant amount, but nothing compared to what David's total estate was worth. The remainder of my estate, Lawton continued, including the house at 1247 Highland Park Boulevard, all investment and retirement accounts totaling approximately $2.5 million, my ownership stake in Thompson Software Solutions, and all proceeds from life insurance policies, I leave entirely to my father, Milton Burton. The conference room fell completely silent. I felt like someone had punched me in the chest. $2.5 million. David had never mentioned having that kind of wealth. His business had been more successful than I'd realized, and he'd been far more frugal with his spending than I'd known. Sarah's chair scraped against the floor as she shot to her feet. That's impossible. I'm his wife, community property laws in California. Lawton held up a hand calmly. Mrs. Burton, David was very careful about the legal structure of his assets. Before your marriage, he established a trust that clearly defined all property as separate, not community. You signed a prenuptial agreement acknowledging this arrangement. I never signed any prenuptial agreement, Sarah shouted, her composure completely cracking. Lawton reached into his folder and produced a document. This is your signature, witnessed and notarized from 3 days before your wedding. Sarah stared at this paper, her face cycling through shock, rage, and something that looked like panic. This can't be valid. David wouldn't have changed it without telling me. We were married. We shared everything. I have a letter here from David, Lawton said, producing a sealed envelope. He requested that this be read aloud if there were any questions about his intentions. But before he could open the letter, Sarah grabbed it from his hands. If it's about David's intentions as his wife, I have the right to read it first. She tore open the envelope with shaking fingers, her eyes scanning the handwritten pages inside. As she read, her face went from pale to gray to green. Her hands started trembling so violently that the papers rustled audibly. This is, she started to say, then stopped. She read more, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Mrs. Burton, Lawton asked, are you all right? Sarah looked up from the letter, her eyes darting between my face and Jake's and Linda's. Whatever David had written, it was devastating to her. She stood unsteadily, gripping the edge of the table. I need some air, she whispered. But before she could take a step toward the door, her eyes rolled back in her head and she collapsed to the floor in a dead faint, David's letter scattered beside her unconscious form. Jake immediately called 911 while Linda rushed to Sarah's side, checking for a pulse and trying to revive her. Lawton and I both dove for the letter pages, desperate to understand what had caused such a violent reaction. I reached the first page and began reading David's familiar handwriting. Dad, if you're reading this, I'm probably gone and Sarah has likely tried to kill you too. Don't trust her. Don't eat or drink anything she gives you. She's been poisoning me slowly for months with antifreeze mixed into my coffee every morning. I have evidence hidden in our house, audio recordings of her planning my murder with someone else. She doesn't know I figured it out and she doesn't know I changed my will. Be very careful, Dad. She's more dangerous than either of us ever imagined. The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes. But by then Sarah had regained consciousness and was sitting in a chair, pale and shaky but alert. Detective Maria Rodriguez from the LAPD arrived shortly after the ambulance, having been called by Lawton, who'd heard enough of David's letter to realize this was now a potential murder investigation. As the paramedics checked Sarah's vital signs, I pulled Detective Rodriguez aside and showed her David's letter. Her expression grew increasingly grim as she read each page. Mr. Burton, she said quietly, I need you to tell me everything about this morning, starting from the beginning. I spent the next hour in a separate conference room recounting everything to Detective Rodriguez, Eleanor's early morning witness of Sarah sabotaging my truck, the cut brake line that Joe Martinez had discovered, David's strange phone calls in the weeks before his death, and now the revelations in his letter. Detective Rodriguez was thorough, taking detailed notes and asking pointed questions about the timeline of events. She was particularly interested in David's mention of hidden evidence in his house. Mr. Burton, with your consent as the inheritor of the property, we'd like to search the house immediately. If David really did hide recordings and other evidence, we need to find them before anyone else does. Through the conference room window, I could see Sarah in the hallway, no longer unconscious, but now in heated discussion with a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, dark-haired, wearing an expensive suit that didn't quite hide the fact that he looked more like muscle than a lawyer. "Who's that with Sarah?" I asked Detective Rodriguez. She followed my gaze and frowned. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Wait here." She left the conference room and approached Sarah and the mysterious man. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could see the body language tense, argumentative with lots of pointing and aggressive gestures. After a few minutes, Detective Rodriguez returned with a grim expression. "That's Marcus Webb, apparently Sarah's attorney. But when I ran his name through our system, he's got a record for assault and fraud. Not exactly the kind of lawyer most people hire for estate disputes." We left the law office in 2 cars, Detective Rodriguez and I in her unmarked police vehicle, followed by a patrol car with 2 uniformed officers. The drive to Highland Park took 30 minutes, and I spent the entire trip thinking about all the times I'd visited that house, all the family dinners and holiday celebrations, never suspecting that it was the scene of a slow-motion murder. The house looked exactly as it had during my last visit 6 months earlier, beautifully maintained craftsman architecture, manicured lawn, the kind of place that represented the American dream. But now it felt sinister, like a beautiful trap. Detective Rodriguez had obtained a search warrant during our drive, and she presented it to the patrol officers before we entered. "Mr. Burton, you know this house better than we do. Where would David have been most likely to hide something he didn't want Sarah to find?" I thought about my son's personality, his methodical engineering mind. David was always organized, but he was also paranoid about security. He'd have hidden anything important somewhere that looked ordinary but was actually clever. We started in David's home office, a converted bedroom on the 2nd floor that overlooked the backyard. The room was exactly as I remembered: computer desk bookshelves, lined with technical manuals, a filing cabinet, and David's collection of vintage engineering equipment that he'd inherited from my father. "Look for anything that seems out of place," Detective Rodriguez instructed her team. I stood in the center of the room, trying to think like David. Where would he hide evidence in a space that Sarah had access to every day? It had to be somewhere she wouldn't think to look or wouldn't be able to access easily. Then I remembered something from David's childhood. When he was 12, he'd built a secret compartment behind his bedroom bookshelf to hide his comic book collection from neighborhood kids who might steal them. He'd been proud of that hidden space, showing it to me, but making me promise not to tell anyone else. "Detective," I said, walking to the built-in bookshelf that covered most of one wall, "help me move this." The bookshelf was heavy, loaded with technical manuals and programming guides, but with the help of the 2 patrol officers, we managed to slide it away from the wall. Behind it, exactly as I'd hoped, was a small panel that had been removed and replaced. Detective Rodriguez put on latex gloves and carefully lifted the panel. Inside the wall cavity was a shoebox containing a digital voice recorder, a folder full of documents, and 3 small vials of liquid. "Bingo," she whispered. We took everything to the dining room table and began going through David's hidden evidence. The voice recorder contained dozens of recordings time-stamped over the past 4 months. Detective Rodriguez played the first one, and Sarah's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. "How much more of this stuff do I need to give him before it works?" Sarah was asking someone. A male voice I didn't recognize replied, "Patience, baby. Antifreeze poisoning has to look natural. Too much, too fast, and the doctors will figure it out. Small doses in his coffee every morning, maybe some in his wine at dinner. It'll take 3 or 4 months, but it'll look like kidney failure or liver disease." What about the old man? "We'll deal with Milton after David's gone. Make it look like he can't handle the grief, maybe a suicide or an accident. Once they're both out of the picture, you inherit everything and we can pay off my debts." My legs went weak. I had to sit down as the full scope of their plan became clear. They hadn't just murdered David, they'd planned to kill me too, probably making it look like I'd committed suicide from grief over losing my son. Detective Rodriguez fast-forwarded through the recordings, finding conversation after conversation between Sarah and the man she called Marcus. They discussed dosages, timing how to avoid suspicion, and detailed plans for my death that made my blood run cold. The documents in the folder were even more damning: internet searches on David's computer about antifreeze poisoning life insurance policies that Sarah had convinced David to increase just 6 months before his death, and medical records showing that David had been experiencing symptoms consistent with poisoning for months. "This is first-degree murder," Detective Rodriguez said grimly. "Premeditated, planned out over months, with an additional conspiracy to commit murder against you." One of the patrol officer's radios crackled to life. Sarah had been arrested at the law office along with Marcus Webb. Both were being brought to the police station for questioning. Mr. Burton, Detective Rodriguez said, "I need you to understand that this is going to be a long process. There will be a trial testimony, months of legal proceedings. Are you prepared for that?" I looked around David's house thinking about all the dreams he'd had, all the plans cut short by Sarah's greed and Marcus's debts. Detective, my son died believing he could trust the woman he married. He spent his last months being slowly poisoned, probably wondering why he was getting sick, maybe thinking he was going crazy. If testifying against his killers is what it takes to get justice, then yes, I'm absolutely prepared for that. The trial took 8 months to reach its conclusion, and every day of it was both heartbreaking and cathartic. Sarah and Marcus were tried together, facing charges of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence David had hidden proved to be airtight: dozens of voice recordings, documented internet searches, medical evidence of antifreeze poisoning, and testimony from multiple witnesses, including Eleanor Joe Martinez and the medical examiner who'd performed David's autopsy. Sarah's defense attorney tried to claim that Marcus had manipulated her, that she'd been an unwilling participant in the plot. But the recordings clearly showed her as an active, enthusiastic participant who'd suggested several methods for killing me after David's death. Marcus's lawyer attempted an insanity defense, claiming his gambling debts had driven him to desperation. The prosecution countered with evidence of similar schemes he'd attempted in other states, showing a pattern of predatory behavior targeting wealthy widows and vulnerable families. The moment that broke the case wide open came during Sarah's testimony. Under cross-examination by the district attorney, she was confronted with a recording where she discussed feeling excited about David's declining health. "It's working," her voice said through the courtroom speakers. "He can barely get out of bed in the mornings now. Another month of this and he'll be too weak to go to work. Then we can suggest he needs to update his will for health reasons." When asked to explain this comment, Sarah broke down completely, admitting that she'd not only poisoned David, but had enjoyed watching him suffer. The jury recoiled in horror, and I saw several jurors wipe tears from their eyes. My own testimony focused on David's character, his love for life, and the subtle warning signs I'd missed. I talked about the phone calls where he'd tried to tell me something was wrong, the gradual isolation from family that Sarah had orchestrated in the morning when Eleanor's vigilance had saved my life. Eleanor herself was a star witness. Her detailed account of seeing Sarah sabotage my truck delivered with the precision of a longtime librarian accustomed to careful observation and accurate record-keeping. Joe Martinez testified about the deliberate nature of the brake line cut, explaining to the jury exactly how the sabotage would have caused a fatal accident. Jake Thompson and Linda Martinez provided crucial testimony about David's behavior in his final months, describing how he'd seemed increasingly paranoid and had started locking his office, something he'd never done before. Linda broke down crying when she described David asking her to witness some documents without telling her what they were, documents that turned out to be his updated will. The most powerful moment came when the prosecution played David's voice recordings in court. Through electronic evidence, my dead son was able to testify against his own murderers. His voice weak and sometimes confused from the poisoning, but still recognizably, David described his growing suspicion that Sarah was making him sick. "I think Sarah is putting something in my coffee," one recording said. "Every morning after I drink it, I feel worse, nauseous, dizzy, like my head is wrapped in cotton. But when I drink coffee at work, I'm fine. It doesn't make sense unless—" The jury heard David's voice trail off as he realized the horrible truth about his wife. On the day of the verdict, I sat in the front row of the courtroom gallery holding Eleanor's hand for support. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with guilty verdicts on all counts: first-degree murder for David's death, conspiracy to commit murder for the plot against me, and attempted murder for the brake sabotage. Sarah was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Marcus received 25 years. As the judge read the sentences, Sarah turned to look at me for the first time since the trial began. I saw no remorse in her eyes, only rage that her plan had failed. Outside the courthouse, Detective Rodriguez shook my hand. "Your son was a smart man, Mr. Burton. Even while he was dying, he made sure justice would be served." I inherited David's house, but I couldn't live there. Every room held memories of family gatherings. But now those memories were tainted by the knowledge of what had really been happening behind Sarah's perfect hostess facade. I sold the property and used part of the money to establish the David Burton Engineering Scholarship at UCLA, ensuring that my son's memory would help other young engineers achieve their dreams. The rest of David's estate I invested conservatively, planning to use it for charitable giving and to ensure Eleanor's security in her advancing years. She'd become more than a neighbor. She was family in the truest sense, the guardian angel who'd saved my life through her early morning garden routine. 6 months after the trial ended, I was sitting on my new front porch in a smaller house just 3 blocks from my old neighborhood. Eleanor had helped me find the place, a modest 2-bedroom bungalow with a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers like Margaret used to do. The healing process had been slow and difficult. I'd spent months in counseling, working through the trauma of losing David, the betrayal by Sarah, and the guilt over not recognizing the warning signs earlier. My therapist, Dr. Patricia Coleman, helped me understand that David had been the victim of sophisticated psychological manipulation as well as physical poisoning, and that even trained professionals might have missed the subtle signs. Eleanor had become a constant presence in my recovery, visiting most evenings for dinner and conversation. She'd lost her own husband 10 years earlier and understood the particular loneliness of widowhood. We'd developed an easy friendship based on shared loss, but also shared hope for whatever years remained to us. "You know," Eleanor said one evening as we sat watching the sunset from my porch, "David would be proud of how you handled everything. The trial, the way you've honored his memory with the scholarship, the way you've chosen forgiveness over bitterness." Forgiveness had been the hardest part. I'd spent months consumed with rage, not just at Sarah and Marcus, but at myself for failing to protect David. Dr. Coleman had helped me understand that forgiveness wasn't about excusing their crimes or pretending the pain didn't matter. It was about refusing to let their evil continue poisoning my life the way Sarah had poisoned David's coffee. I'd started attending a grief support group at the community center where I met other people who'd lost children to violence, disease, or accidents. Sharing our stories and supporting each other's healing became an unexpected source of strength. I even began dating again tentatively after meeting Patricia Hernandez, a retired teacher whose husband had died 3 years earlier. Patricia was gentle, patient, and understood that loving someone who's experienced profound loss means accepting that the grief never completely disappears. It just transforms into something more manageable. We'd started with coffee dates that stretched into long walks, then dinners where we'd share stories about our deceased spouses without jealousy or competition. The scholarship fund had awarded its first grants to 3 engineering students: Maria Santos, a first-generation college student from East Los Angeles; James Wilson, a young man from Detroit who wanted to design sustainable housing; and Amy Chen, a brilliant young woman interested in earthquake-resistant building design. Seeing their excitement and gratitude reminded me that David's death, while senseless and tragic, could still generate positive energy in the world. I'd also started volunteering with the police department's victim services program, helping other families navigate the complex process of criminal trials and estate settlements. Detective Rodriguez had suggested it, thinking my experience might help others avoid some of the pitfalls I'd encountered. It was difficult work, emotionally demanding, but it felt like a way to honor both David's memory and Eleanor's example of looking out for others. Late at night, when the grief hit hardest, I'd sometimes sit in David's old room in my house, which I'd converted into a memorial space with his photos awards and some of his engineering projects. I'd read his letter again, marveling at his courage in the face of something so terrifying, and his determination to protect me even while he was dying. The letter ended with words that had become my guiding principle. "Dad, don't let this make you afraid to trust people. Mom always said the world has more good people than bad ones. Find the good ones and hold on to them tight. Live the rest of your life like someone worth saving, because you are." On the anniversary of David's death, I visited his grave with Eleanor, Patricia, and the 3 scholarship recipients. We brought flowers and stories, sharing memories of David and talking about the ways his life continued to influence others. Maria Santos had maintained a 4.0 GPA in her freshman engineering courses. James Wilson had already started designing innovative housing prototypes. Amy Chen was working on a research project about earthquake sensors that could save thousands of lives. Standing there in the cemetery, surrounded by people who cared about David's memory and my well-being, I realized that Sarah and Marcus had failed completely. They'd intended to destroy our family and steal David's legacy. Instead, their evil had been exposed, justice had been served, and David's life was generating more good in the world than it might have if they'd never entered our lives. That doesn't mean I'm grateful for what happened. I'd trade everything to have David back, to see him grow older, maybe become a father himself, achieve all the dreams that were cut short. But I've learned that we don't get to choose our tragedies. We only get to choose how we respond to them. I chose to respond with love instead of hatred, with trust instead of paranoia, with hope instead of despair. I chose to believe, as Margaret always had, that the world contains more good people than bad ones, and that our job is to find the good ones and build lives together that honor the memory of those we've lost. Eleanor, who saved my life through her careful attention and courage to speak up. Detective Rodriguez, who pursued justice with skill and compassion. Dr. Coleman, who helped me heal. Patricia, who showed me that love can bloom again even in soil poisoned by grief. The scholarship students who proved that David's dreams live on in other young minds. These are the good people. Margaret talked about the ones worth trusting and holding tight. They didn't erase the pain of losing David or undo the evil that Sarah and Marcus committed, but they proved that evil doesn't get the final word in any story unless we let it. Have you ever had someone in your life who seemed trustworthy but turned out to be dangerous? How did you learn to trust again after being betrayed by someone close to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story touched you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming betrayal and finding justice. Share this with someone who might need to hear that healing is possible even after the worst kind of loss. Thank you for listening to David's story and mine, and remember that no matter what darkness you're facing, there are always good people ready to help you find the light again.